This just in, research has confirmed that the lighter you are, the better your quality of life will be. So, how light are you? I'm not talking about weight. That's an entirely different matter. The lightness I'm referring to is an attitude. It's a sense of humor. Now, humor is more than joke-telling. It's the ability to stay flexible, thrive in change, adapt to all kinds of ambiguity, and stay healthy and creative in the face of difficulty. According to author C.W. Metcalf, the humor which gives you grace under pressure isn't some cosmic quirk. It's a set of specific learned skills. In this program, recorded live at one of CW's corporate workshops, you'll learn 3 vital humor skills. The first is the ability to see absurdity in difficult situations. The second is the ability to take yourself lightly while taking your work seriously. And the third is a disciplined sense of joy in being alive. So let's join CW now and learn how you can be relaxed and resilient, productive and creative in a world that doesn't necessarily want to cooperate.
What we're going to talk about today, that's silly. Speaker gets up here and says, what we're going to talk about. You're not going to say much of anything. What I'm going to talk about is the fact that humor, as we understand it, is a set of developed skills, abilities that take a discipline to evolve. You are not born with or without them. And a lot of people think they're born with or without a sense of humor. All their lives they've been either able to roll with the punches and laugh it off, and they wonder what everybody's so grumpy about. Or they're walking around going, what's everybody laughing at? Don't they understand the situation here? A lot of us suffer from terminal professionalism. And if it seems to strike a chord. If you're professional, you're hardworking, hard-headed, hard-nosed, hard-hearted. All those nice, soft, flexible terms. If you're laughing and having a good time, you're a dingbat. An airhead who's certainly not qualified for leadership. Do you know that's the opposite of a medical fact? The medical fact is that one of the first indicators of the onset of most mental illness and many physical illnesses is a loss of the sense of joy in being alive. Everybody here has experienced getting a cold, and the day or two before the onset of the cold, you start feeling a little grumpy. Before you ever start to feel really sick, you start to feel a little grumpy and out of sorts. How we got that turned around, how we got to the place where we thought that humor and joy and laughter and lightheartedness were somehow the opposite of seriousness and intelligence and high-mindedness and professionalism, I'm not quite sure. Oh, there are a lot of reasons. We have a lot of strange attitudes about humor and joy. You have probably said this to your children, or your parents said it to you when you were growing up. Wipe that stupid smile off your face. Smiling is stupid. That information starts real early in many of our lives. Or have you ever heard this one or said this to your kids? Grow up, get serious. Growing up is getting serious. We're going to talk today something about what humor is and is not. We're going to talk about how sometimes it gets suppressed and erased in our lives. We're going to talk about how to redevelop it and the discipline and the tools that it takes to develop it, and how it affects your mental and physical health, and how it affects your capacity to cope with crisis and change. So we're not going to just talk about jokes. I hope we have a good time and I hope we laugh, because you don't have to tell jokes to stimulate laughter. I mean, you're going to smile and laugh in your life more often at the sight of things like a baby crawling across the floor. You're just watching the baby and you're smiling. Or at a sunset. My father-in-law is a minister, and when I visit him in the town where he ministers, he spares no expense. He always takes me to dinner, always to Bob's Big Boy, because the church has a ministerial account there, I think. And he works in Sun City, Arizona, which is a retirement community. And we were down there one time having dinner, and we were chatting, and he was looking over my shoulder. He was smiling at something, and I turned around to look, and there was a couple, had to be in their 80s, necking in the restaurant. And I don't mean just a little peck on the cheek. I mean, these two people were tangled up in the booth. They were like, And I got this big grin on my face, and I turned around, and I'm not smiling because I think that's funny, and I said to my father-in-law, I said, John, why are we smiling? And he said, well, I don't know about you, but it gives me a great deal of hope. I have thought a great deal about that sense because you're going to laugh and smile and be uplifted, and that is really what humor is about, isn't it? More often by those kinds of events and people and things in your life than you ever are by jokes. You're going to smile more often in your life and laugh more often at a sudden awareness of your own silliness or at a sudden awareness of something that grants you hope. You're going to smile at those things. That's humor too. So we want to talk about all of those aspects of what humor is and how to develop it. But I want to ask you today for two things. I want to ask you to set aside any concept you have of me. It doesn't make any difference what you think about me. Please get that out of the way. I want you to hear the information and try it. And if you think that these ideas I'm going to share with you are silly, set that aside. And just try the information before you make any decision about it. The second thing that I want to say is I know that there are people here who probably don't feel very good, who are having difficulty in their personal relationships or in their jobs or in their spiritual lives, or just being alive on the planet right now is probably as difficult, certainly, but maybe more difficult in some ways than it has ever been before for the human race. And those world problems and workplace problems and personal problems and interior problems can sometimes rob us of our capacity to feel good even when it's offered to us. So I know there are people out there who feel bad. If you don't find me funny, that's okay. I mean, a lot of people don't find me funny. My mother does not find me funny. My mother is always saying, "Get a real job. This is not going to last. Get a real job." So whether you laugh easily or not at all, it doesn't mean to me you don't or do have a sense of humor. I know a lot of people who don't laugh very easily who have a terrific sense of humor. But what I want to avoid is if you're out there and you've come here today with some really intense personal problems, maybe physical health problems, whatever the problem is, I want you to do your best to leave it in the hallway. I guarantee you it will be waiting for you when you leave. It may even have gotten worse, all right? But if you're going to get the full value of the tools and the ideas that we're going to explore today, I want to ask you to be open to that. Listen, nobody here needs a course in human misery. You know, if I put on a workshop and called it Suffering 1A, how to have a bad time being alive, nobody would come. Because you get that for free. You wake up in the morning and pain and suffering and misery and trauma are waiting by your bed going, "Good morning, Bubba. Let's go to work." Joy and lightheartedness and fun and humor and the things that keep us flexible and make the battle worth fighting are not things that come to us by birthright, and they are not things that fall upon us as a matter of grace most often. They are elements that we have to literally discipline ourselves to pursue. The other thing I have to tell you before we get started is I have to tell you something about me, because I think it's real important to know something about the person who stands up here and, as my wife says, preaches. I do tend to get evangelical about this work, I admit it. And my wife says, we've gone to a lot of trouble. We have a lot of very serious medical research to support this information. You get up there, you get all emotional. There are logical people out there, CW, that need a logical support, so don't get too emotional. It's real hard for me not to get emotional about this work. I suppose when the day comes that I am bored to get up here, I'll be given something else to do. This material saved my life. And this is not what I planned to do with my life. One of my first majors in college was wild game management. I wanted to be a forester, you know, and live in the woods as far from people as I could get. And I share some of my life experience with you for two reasons. I think it's critical that you know something about the person who's going to stand up here and talk. And my feeling is that if you're going to listen to someone, if I'm going to listen to someone, I need some vulnerability from that person and some willingness to know more about them than just the statistics and data and lessons they might have to teach. I need to know something about the person. I did not grow up a happy, joyful, fun-loving person. And I share that with people because I know there are a lot of people here who didn't. And I want them to know that a sense of humor is something that can be developed. I grew up in an alcoholic household. I grew up in a very unstable environment. My parents were divorced very early on, and I lived in 5 different homes by the time I was 11 years of age. Because my mother was a single woman looking for a career, and in the 50s and 40s, that was not an easy thing for a woman in this country to do. A single mother, a divorced woman with 2 kids, had a very difficult time of it. So we had to be shuffled sometimes to aunts and uncles' houses and that sort of thing. During that process, I suffered some abuse. And that had a pretty profound effect on me. I think most kids who come from an abusive background have a very difficult time overcoming that. By the time I was 11 years of age, I was utterly convinced that the world was a dark and a dangerous place. And if you didn't watch out, you were going to get the daylights beat out of you, one way or another. I developed some kind of humor as a child, like many kids in my situation do. I was a clown. Not because I thought anything was funny, but because I knew it was a great way to distract people from getting into an argument or starting to whip on me. If I could do something funny or silly and sidetrack it. So I developed what some people might have called on the surface a sense of humor as a very young person, but nothing was funny to me. It was a manipulative device to distract people from hurting me. I grew up essentially in a farm community. My mother moved us because she got a job in a large American city, and we moved to that city when I was about 11 or 12 years of age. My mother was in police work. Are there any ministers' kids or cops' kids in the audience? All right, when willing to admit it, go ahead, put your arm up there. Yeah, because we're some of the most dangerous people on earth. Because if you're a minister's child or a cop's child, you often are forced, you think in your own mind, to become a raging ding-dong in order to make up for being a cop's child or a minister's child. And I went through that phase. At the age of 14, I was a member of a social group called the Eagles of Death. Hard to believe looking at me now, but it's true. And I learned that life was a battle, and that you couldn't trust anyone except the people you knew real well. And even then, you might have some problems if trouble came down. I left that neighborhood and went into the service. That didn't teach me a lot about humor and fun and joy, although I learned some important things there. And then I went to school thinking I was going to go into perhaps forestry. I'll skip the rest of the time because I'm sure that people here have had a life even more miserable than I have. And I don't tell you these stories to gain pity, although I'll take what I can get, I suppose. I tell you because it's critical to understand the way that I have come to understand humor is not that it is something you're born with, not that it is something you are given, although some of you may have grown up in homes that encouraged humor and joy. I think that's wonderful. My experience is most people have not. I went through 3 major career changes, none of which I planned on and none of which I wanted. And I ended up writing for children's television. And something happened there that started this workshop, even though I didn't know it at the time. I was invited to go to work on a project in Tiburon, California. My producer called me one day and said, there's a fellow up there named Jerry Jampolsky, and he's doing some work with terminally ill kids and their families, and we're going to do an after-school special. I want you to go up there and do a script on this. See if there's a story in it. I said, send somebody else. I have absolutely no desire to go work with terminally ill kids. I had at that time gone through a divorce that was very painful to me. I had lost contact with a child that I cared very much for. My life was continuing to be, as I always knew it would from the time I was a child, a miserable, dark, terrifying experience. And he reminded me that I was on staff and payroll, and that I didn't have a lot of choices in the matter. And seeing as how I'd already had 2 careers fall out from under me, I decided I probably better take it. So I did, and I went north to Tiburon, California. Now, I grew up with 2 emotions, anger and extreme anger. That was the gamut of my emotional responses. I have worked very hard to become a more emotionally honest and open person, and I may have gone too far. I find myself now crying at coffee commercials on television. There's one where this elderly woman's face comes on the screen, some coffee commercial. At the end, it's just this elderly woman's face looking out at you. Reminds me of my grandmother. I'm sitting watching this commercial with my wife. I'm going, oh, my wife is, oh. I tell you that because it is difficult for me to tell this story sometimes, and it gets to me. Because when I went to this place, I said to my producer, what's it called? He said, it's called the Center for Attitudinal Healing. I thought, boy, am I in California or what? The Center for Attitudinal Healing. I thought, what do they do there? Karma cleaning? Huh? Third eye alignments? I was a very cynical person. So I went. I arrived there on what they call Family Day, where the brothers and sisters and mothers and fathers and friends and aunts and uncles of all the kids who were in the program all gather together to talk and share experiences. Now, there were about 14 kids in the program at that time, all of whom were diagnosed as terminally ill or traumatically injured to the point where they would most likely die. I think you would expect, as I did, to walk into a room where there was a lot of sort of darkness and depression and sadness, and I walked into a room full of the happiest people I'd ever seen in my life. And I hated them. You know, when you run into a group of people who, in the minute you meet them, totally destroy everything that you have ever thought was true, everything you've gone to a great deal of difficulty to put together as the truth, and you walk into a room full of people who have one problem, makes all yours look like dust in the wind, they're happy, you're miserable, your first response is not to say, I've been so stupid, tear apart my life and teach me how to live again, will you please? It's kind of like when you're having a bad day and you meet somebody who's enjoying themselves. You're trying to have a good bad day, you're really getting into it. Really enjoying this misery. Showing people how hard you're working by how miserable you are. Stress is the new red badge of courage. Well, I must be doing a good job and really devoted to this company because I've got an ulcer, a heart attack, and my family's leaving me, for God's sake. You know, you're having a bad day and you meet one of those people who goes, oh, come on, lighten up. Hey, That's how I felt when I walked into the center. I was so cynical that the first note I wrote, I keep it as a reminder of where I've come from. I saw all these people. Some of these kids were little stick figures. They'd lost so much weight. Some of them had lost all their hair to chemotherapy and radiation treatments. And they were laughing. And I wrote in my notebook, find out what kind of drugs they're taking. Because I believe that anybody facing that kind of crisis and change and difficulty must, of necessity, be either under the sway of some obscene guru, totally out of their mind, or drugged. And while I'm standing there making notes, trying not to get too involved, these people are all hugging each other and laughing and playing. There's one kid in a wheelchair who is racing other kids up and down the living room. This kid came up and pulled on my coat. Now, I have been doing these trainings for nearly 5 years now. And I have told this story probably 500 times. And every time I tell it, it still gets to me. Because it was the point in my life, it's the closest thing I've ever had to a spiritual experience. No bushes have erupted in flame in front of me. A lightning has not stricken a pole next to me, and I've heard God's voice saying, and now, this is what I want you to do. But this was as close as that experience ever happened in my life. This kid pulls on my coat. And I turned around and said, what is it? And the kid said, do you want to sit down? You don't look so well. And I saw the concern in this kid's eyes, and I couldn't believe it. He thought I was a patient. He thought I was sick. He was right. I was sick with terminal seriousness. And something in that kid's eyes just cracked me. Now, I hadn't cried since I was 7 years old, because a man didn't cry. I learned that early. And as an adult, I knew that. My house might be burning down, my wife might be running off with another man, I might have an alligator affixed right here. But I'm a man, I can handle it, no problem, okay? It's okay. I'll have a heart attack and be right back. So I didn't really know how to cry. The only time I had really even approached it was out of self-pity. And I saw the concern in this kid's eyes, and I couldn't say anything. He was totally outside my experience, this kid, about 9, 10 years old. And my mouth came open, and my face sort of twitched, and I remember standing there looking at him, and he takes my hand, and he says, "That's okay, I was scared in the beginning, too." He said, "If you want to talk to somebody, I'll be right over there." That got to me. I eventually quit my job, and I went up to the center because I wanted to work there. I didn't do very well, and I didn't stay because I depressed people, I think. But as a result of that experience, I got involved in hospice work. Now, it may sound odd to start off a humor workshop talking to you about work with cancer patients, especially with children, but I'm going to tell you something. That's where I first learned what humor is, that it's far more than jokes, that it has a power capable of preserving and sustaining the meaning of life, that it is not the way, the truth, and the light, you know, and I sometimes forget that. It's a part of the pie. But it's an awfully important part. And as things get more and more critical in the world that we live in and in the lives that we're leading, we tend to set these things aside because, well, we don't have time for it right now. Working with cancer patients and their families as a hospice volunteer and trainer for several years, and I've been with dozens of people who were at or near the moment of death, I have never heard anybody say to me, "Gee, I wish I had more in my savings account." That's never been anybody's last concern. Nobody has ever said to me, "I wish I'd owned a Porsche before I died." You know what people say? They say things like, "I wish I'd played a little more and worked a little less." I did 156 presentations last year. I flew 150,000 miles. At the end of the year, my staff was answering the phone saying, "I'm sorry, Mr. Metcalf's sick from doing too many humor and health workshops." I have to fight real hard to practice what I preach. I'm not up here because I've got this down pat. I'm up here because I've been working with it on a day-in, day-out basis, and I still have to do the things I'm going to talk to you about doing to develop a sense of humor. But when you hear things like that from people over and over again, it affects you. And I started to notice that there were some people who had certain kinds of things in common. And if they had certain elements in their attitude and their personality, they seemed to do more often much better than the people who didn't have those things. And I noticed the same thing in the physicians that I worked with and the nurses, that if they had those skills, they tended not to burn out. They tended to continue to be of value to people in crisis situations and not to get as sick as the people they were working with. And that's where I first began to understand what humor was. When somebody says to you in the last days of their life, "I wish I'd learned a little bit more about having a good time while I was here," it has a real strong effect. Because no matter what kind of change and crisis and stress you are going through in your life, probably the greatest change or stressor you would ever have to face is confronting your own mortality. It has a tendency to strip away all of the extraneous self-pity. It can. Sometimes it can make it stronger. But there were some people who suddenly seemed to face that and find something that I desperately wanted to know about. I actually had a hospice patient say this to me once. I walked in and I said, "How you doing?" They said, "Listen, I want to tell you something. You're a real nice person, and I know you're trying to help. But I wish you'd find me another hospice volunteer to work with. You are really depressing me." I said, "I beg your pardon? What do you mean depressing you?" I got real defensive. He said, "Well, every time you come in, I try to lighten up, you know, you come in with this long look on your face like I'm already dead." Said, "I want somebody who still knows how to live while I'm living." Said, "I try to tell you jokes, you don't really laugh." I said, "Well, I didn't think it was appropriate." He said, "Let me be the judge of that." Those kinds of experiences started to affect me. I am not going to tell you that humor and laughter and lightheartedness and all the things we're going to talk about today cure cancer. They don't cure baldness, I know that. They aren't going to solve all your problems. That's insane. Problems are how you learn and grow. But the skills that we're going to talk about today as humor, those humor skills can help you stay loose and flexible in the face of change and difficulty. They can help you face crisis without becoming embittered and broken by it. And this isn't big news. A minister came up to me after a 36-hour version of this workshop that I had done for a company. And he walked up to me and he said, "That's very interesting." He said, "But Mr. Metcalf, I can do the entire workshop in 2 sentences. I said, "Thank you so much for your support. Very kind of you." I said, "What are the sentences?" He said, "A merry heart doeth like a good medicine, but a brittle spirit drieth the bones." Proverbs 17:22. Isn't that what you're saying? I said, "Yes, but I have medical proof." And he said, "I don't need medical proof." That news has been around for a long time. It's in every major spiritual structure on the face of the planet. Something akin to, a merry heart doeth like a good medicine, but a brittle spirit drieth the bones. It is a wisdom as ancient as human thinking. And yet we have failed to incorporate it at the most critical times in our lives. And now modern science is beginning to show that that's exactly what humor is. And that's really what we're going to talk about today. A set of skills that allow you to stay loose and flexible in the face of difficulty, so you're more likely to solve the problems that you're confronted with and less likely to come out on the other side of it embittered and broken and brittle.
In Old Middle English, the word silly was pronounced selig, and it meant being healthy, wealthy, prosperous, and happy. It was a blessing, and it still is today. The willingness to be silly is the key to overcoming your fear of foolishness. Embarrassing situations are going to happen. They're simply a part of life, but that's not a big problem in and of itself. The problem comes if you believe the old comedic formula, if it happens to someone else, it's funny. If it happens to me, it's tragic. If you take that perspective, you're much less capable of handling pressure-filled situations with grace. As CW explains on this cassette side, your best course of action is to maintain your sense of humor and take things as they come.
We have to start with the primary block to what a sense of humor is. It's something called fear of foolishness, fear of failure. Everyone in this room has said to themselves at one time or another in your life, I'm so embarrassed, I wish I were dead. I'm so embarrassed I could just die. Pretty severe reaction to embarrassment, don't you think? To wish you were dead? Why would we associate embarrassing ourselves, making a fool of ourselves, or failing with death? And we do. Boy, I blew that. God, that just kills me. We have all these illusions to why failing and making a fool of ourselves can kill us. We're going to talk about that because you have to understand why it is we feel that way. But first we're going to do a fear of foolishness exercise. I want you to sit up straight, like your mama said you should. On the count of 3, I am going to ask you to stand, take a very deep breath, and smile the largest smile you know how to make. It's a fairly simple exercise. And then when we sit down, I want you to let the breath out and groan. I want you to go, oh. Now, some of you will stand and breathe, and you'll think you're smiling, and your face won't change. Yeah, I mentioned earlier I do a lot of work in corporate environments, trying to bring some joy back to the workplace because it's so connected to team building and communication and bonding and productivity and quality control, all those things. And I'll go in sometimes and work with the board of directors, and I'll say, ladies and gentlemen, give me the biggest smile you've got, and these people will go. Veins will stand out in their neck, and their face will barely twitch. Because we're so used to using the face and the body as a mask. And we have our serious face. It lets people know how intelligent we are, how serious we are. And you see these people and they laugh and they go, ah. I know that some of you think these exercises are silly. If you'd asked me to do these 10 years ago, I'd have gotten up and walked out of the room, much to my own downfall. These exercises are not stupid. They're silly. There's a big difference between stupid and silly. This is silly. Are you ready? On the count of 3. You're going to stand, breathe, and the biggest smile you've got. 1, 2, hit it. 3, go. Let me see it. Here, come on, here. Now sit down and groan. Oh. Boy. You got the groaning part down. But isn't that interesting? Nobody told a joke. And a lot of you started laughing. But a lot of you, when you stood, breathed, and smiled, there's some people out there who went, oh, for God's sake. as though smiling itself were somehow an indication of the fact that I'm not a very strong person. You know, a lot of us have been trained and we have learned a lot of forbiddens, which we will also talk about later. I had one woman in a workshop who came up to me afterwards and said, my mother died when my sisters and I, there are 4 of us, girls, were 10 to 15 years old, and my father raised us, and he did a great job, and we were all well educated. She said, but I recognized something while you were talking. Every time he came into the room and found us giggling, he would slap us on the face. Not hard, just a little, and he'd say, listen to me, people aren't going to think you're very intelligent if you act like that. Now, a lot of us have not grown up with forbiddens that were that dramatic, but I know that experience is not uncommon. We were taught, some of us when we were very young, that a display of joy was somehow a sign of a lack of intelligence, when it's exactly the opposite of the truth. I want you to understand how that fear of foolishness and that fear of failure inhibits so much of our growth when we associate the idea with death. There's a word I want you all to become familiar with. The word is psychoneuroimmunology. It's spelled just like it sounds. Because it is psychoneuroimmunology, a very recently evolving field of medical study that has begun to secure for us an understanding of why we associate fear of foolishness and fear of failing with death and dying. Psychoneuroimmunology is a field of medical study. It wasn't named until 1981, but it is a field of medical study that is going to revolutionize our understanding of medicine, already is in many environments, and our understanding of the interaction between the human mind and the human body. Psychoneuroimmunology, if you break the word down, is fairly self-explanatory. It is the study of the interrelationship of psychology, your belief systems, your values, how you perceive yourself, how you think, neurology, your brain chemistry, and immunology, your immune system. Psychoneuroimmunology, PNI, studies the interrelationship of those elements and tries to understand how does emotion and mental perspective and attitude influence brain chemistry and the immune system. And we're going to discuss that a little bit more later, but right now I want to talk to you about how it fits into this fear of foolishness and failure. Think of the last time you made a fool of yourself. Think about maybe that time when you were trying very hard to impress a group of people and you walked out on stage to make a presentation to a group at work or something, and you did one of those where you did this good after, oh, tripped and almost fell, and your face goes red, your mouth goes dry. Think of those times when you tried something and wanted it to succeed, worked for months on some project, and then handed it in to your supervisor, and they went, oh, Lord, you don't really believe this, do you? I hope you didn't put in too much time on this. You completely blew this. And that feeling that comes over you. There is a very strong reason why we associate failing and foolishness with death. Sometimes it can be so severe. I do some work with young people. And being a teenager is one of the most difficult arenas of existence. I mean, when you're a teenager, everything is embarrassing. It's embarrassing to have parents when you're a teenager, you know. I don't have parents. I live in a box in the alley. I don't have any parents. We're trying so hard to fit in and be accepted. A lot of us are living with humor, skills, and understandings that were shaped when we were in junior high school on very incomplete information that we've lived with all our lives. But I've worked with some kids who tried so hard. Hey, why beat around the bush? When I was a kid, I tried very hard to fit into this group that I was with. And I did a thing one time that I thought was really going to secure my sort of macho image with the group. Because when you're a little... Now, look, I started going bald when I was 16, okay? I was scrawny. I had a speech impediment. I was not a real impressive figure. Sort of the advanced guard of nerds in America. And I did something, I tried very hard to fit into this group and be taken real seriously, and I blew it completely. And people laughed at me, and they used to tell this story about this thing I had done. I was so humiliated. I was 15 years old. I attempted to kill myself. I thought my life was over. It can be that serious for us, ladies and gentlemen, that fear of failing and foolishness. On the other hand, I had an experience that I share with people because it's common, especially to many men in the audience. One of the greatest fears we have is appearing in front of a group unzipped. And... No, I had all my zippers Velcroed. I don't worry about it anymore. That's why men usually wear very long ties that hang down like this. But I was in front of a group about 3 years ago at the Mayo affiliate hospitals, and it was very important for them to understand that I was not going to be talking about, laughter cures cancer and laughter solves all your problems, and if you just learn to laugh, you never need to see another doctor. That's insane. Those people are going to die laughing. It's not that simple. Anyway, I'm standing up there and I'm talking to this group of physicians and nurses, and it was going real well, and I was so relieved because their support meant a great deal to me in this work. And I went off stage for a break, and I came back and I started talking, and nobody was looking at me. You know what it's like? You're standing in front of 600 people, and they're all looking at the ceiling, looking around. And I had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, and my throat started to go dry, and you get nervous, lots of things happen, and you sweat, and if you're a bald person and you sweat, there's no hair to absorb, it runs right into your eyes. I got sweat running down my forehead, my muscles are tightening, my stomach is tightening. And every time I would get over to this side of the stage, there's a woman sitting right about in the front row where you are, and she'd look up at me and go, zzz, 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 zzz. So I'd come over here, and I'd talk for a while. Then I'd come back over here. And every time she would see me, she would go, zzz, 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 zzz. And I could not, for the life of me, figure out what she was doing. Finally, she's making this gesture and this noise, and I came back over, and she's going, zzz, zzz. I said, what is it? She said, honey, you're unzipped. Well, I wear pleated trousers, and when you wear pleated trousers and you're unzipped, you're not just unzipped, you are unzipped. And I looked down. Now, that would not have been the worst of it. But it's difficult to maintain a solid, strong marital relationship when you share a lot of time together. In my marriage, I'm on the road a lot. So my wife and I don't see each other as much as we would like to and hope to someday. So we do a lot of little things to try and stay in touch. Send little surprises to one another. She once hid banana nut muffins in the suitcase. I didn't find them for a week. I'm walking around, people are going, do you own a monkey or something? But I am an avid fly fisherman, a trout fisherman. It is one of the great passions in my life. And as a sort of amusement, my wife and I one time went down to this little store in Breckenridge, Colorado, and bought some underwear with a trout painted on the crotch. That day I was wearing my German brown. I looked down, here's this fish. What happens, Your heartbeat goes up, your blood pressure rises, lactic acid rushes into the muscles, cortisol and adrenaline go coursing through the system. I got lightheaded, my throat went dry. What are you going to do? Say, nice fish, isn't it? So I turned around to zip up, and men know what happens if you try to zip up real fast. I caught the underwear, the zipper got stuck. I'm standing in front of all these people feeling like such an idiot, and I'm doing this, and I'm trying, pardon me. And then to add insult to injury, some fellow came up to me afterwards and said, you did that on purpose, didn't you? I thought, what kind of person do they think I am? But every one of us, that's what I mean. When you get into this work, God tests you. He says, oh, you think that's funny, huh? Watch this. Snap. Well, how do all these things relate? They relate in the following manner. What psychoneuroimmunology has brought home to us with a number of very, very well-substantiated studies is a concept we have known and thought about for a great many centuries, and that is that your mind cannot tell the difference between a threat to your physical life, someone pointing a gun at your head, and a threat to your ego. Your mind reacts and triggers exactly the same chemical responses when your ego and your sense of self and your values are threatened as it does when someone puts a gun to your head. Not to the same degree, which is even more dangerous, because it happens at a low level. Think of how many times during the day you feel threatened, either by changes in your work environment, changes in your family structure. You come home, your daughter's hair is green. Oh, it's better than the orange, honey. Keep working on it. What happens, you see, is because your mind can't tell the difference between threats to your ego and threats to your physical self. The fight or flight mechanism is triggered in both of those events. Now, the fight or flight mechanism is one of the critical reasons biologically why we have survived. Think about it. You've all experienced it. Everybody has. It's fairly common knowledge. If you're driving down the road, like we were this morning, and someone in front of you stops very quickly, and you're going, I don't know how fast, but rather rapidly, and you see those taillights go on in front of you, and the back of the car jumps up in the air, and just... what happens? Boy, your heartbeat is going, your blood pressure is up, sweat is running down your face, and you've got this feeling. Huh? And God, you want to kill something, somebody. And it doesn't take a physical threat like that to trigger it. A psychological threat will do the same thing. All somebody's got to do is start yelling at you. Just start yelling at you, and that fight or flight mechanism kicks in. Adrenaline goes pumping through the system. Cortisol levels rise. Blood pressure goes up, heart rate goes up. All of the signals that tell your brain your life is in danger. No wonder we try to avoid making a fool of ourselves and failing, because in our minds we firmly believe it could kill us. We're being chemically told it might. And it doesn't take somebody yelling. Listen, I hate this. This is one of the worst sentences in the English language. I know you're doing the best you can. You just as well come up to someone and say, pardon me, salmon brain. That's all it takes, and that stuff starts to gurgle and boil. And it could be somebody you love. You know, you're with somebody, hopefully you love them, you'd lay down your life for them, you've had your ups, your downs, but you're in love with this person. Far beyond the initial romance, some bonding has taken place. You really know you're going to be with this person, and you walk in and you say to them, honey, I got this great idea, blah, blah, blah. And your spouse goes, you think that's a great idea? That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard. Now, outside, you might be going, well, gee, maybe you're right. But inside, it's like, you feel that stuff happen again. It is critical that we learn to tell the difference between a threat to our ego and a threat to our physical life. Because, ladies and gentlemen, one of the major findings in psychoneuroimmunology in just the last few years is this. As a matter of fact, it is so recent. I've got other information here, but there was an article in the paper this morning from the New England Journal of Medicine talking about how a particular hormone, which is released during stressful situations, inhibits the ability of white blood cells to manufacture antibodies that fight disease. Now, other studies in PNI have shown that for a long time. But the more conservative New England Journal of Medicine was waiting for a much larger body of medical research. Well, they've got it. There is a very powerful relationship between how you perceive what's happening to you and what's going on biochemically in your body. And until you learn to tell the difference between a threat to your ego and a threat to your physical life, you are at greater health risk. Because increased amounts of adrenaline that are produced when you perceive a threat, mental or imagined threat, increased amounts of adrenaline in the system does two things. It erodes heart tissue, and it suppresses the immune system's ability to produce T cells. Increased amounts of cortisol that come during those periods of time are associated with depression, and again, with a suppression of the immune system's ability to defend you against disease. We're not talking about an abstract idea. I'm not talking about laugh and your troubles go away. When we look at fear of foolishness and fear of failing, the primary block to developing the humor skills we're going to talk about, we're talking about a life situation. So one of the reasons we do these exercises is to help you experience that you can make a fool of yourself and not die. You've got to learn that. It's very important. I'm serious. You've got to know it. You've got to practice making a fool of yourself. You've got to give yourself to that experience so that when the real thing happens, it doesn't snap you in two. Now, you might as well practice because it's going to happen anyway. So I'm going to give you a couple of exercises that I'd like you to experiment with. Now, there are a lot of other reasons for these physical exercises. But one of them really is you've got to behaviorally train yourself to understand I can make a fool of myself and it doesn't kill me, my IQ doesn't drop, my friends don't abandon me, and I'm not fired. Now, I'm not suggesting you do these exercises at work necessarily. Unless, of course, you plan on quitting, and then why not? All right? On the count of 3, you're going to stand, take a deep breath, and smile the biggest smile you can. Good luck. 1, 2, 3, go. Here, as big as you got. That's it, hold it. Now just let it out and slump. Go, ah. Well, I don't know what happens, but when you try to suppress a yawn, something goes, you ever had that? You're trying to stop the yawn and something in your neck goes, twang! Well, we're going to practice yawning because you already know how to make a fool of yourself. You just don't usually do this in public. I want you to yawn on the count of 3. Now, not the kind of public yawn. Not yet. Okay. I don't want your nice, dignified kind of yawn. I want the sort of yawn that only someone who has lived with you and awakened next to you for 10 years has ever seen. You know you're ugly. They know you're ugly. You just don't care anymore, all right? So I want you to stretch. I want you to get ugly. I want you to make a noise. You ready? On the count of 3. 1, 2. You ready? Here we go. 3. Come on. Now, see, we're so afraid. And if you're going to understand how humor skills can be developed, one of the biggest risks you can take is risking believing something new or trying it. See, you all got up this morning and went to some effort to look like something. Some of you went to more trouble than others. And then you walked out in the world presenting yourself to the world. God forbid anyone should see anything beneath what you have prepared. You want to be noticed. You don't want to be seen. We're like dogs, you know that? One of the tricks I have with my dog if I'm bored is I'll start staring at the dog. You ever done that? And pretty soon the dog goes, You keep it up, drive her right out of the room. People are the same way. You go to a restaurant, pick somebody you don't know, start staring at them. Pretty soon they'll be going, Ladies and gentlemen, the purpose of these exercises is multifold. But one of the primaries is to get used to seeing that if you do something silly, you don't drop dead. So I want you to practice it, okay? I want you to just try it.